Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Utski. In this video I will talk about chords. So let's go. As I said before, chords is basically when you play more than one note at the same time, and usually chords use scales as it is guideline because it's already like proved in a certain way that which notes or which space between these notes are actually good to listen to. So it's a consonant. To make a chord, as I said, just place two notes at the same time. So like this, cheap instrument. So this could be considered a chord. Maybe not good as you expected, but this is a chord. It can be triad, three notes at the same time. It can be tetradic, four notes at the same time. Pentagonic, five notes at the same time. And you can always stack thirds upon already existent chords. So for example, B would be our seventh in a C major chord. So, but we can still going further, for example, extend to D, F, and so on. So usually normal chords goes up to seventh, so it's basically four tetradic, but I will reach right there. I will reach this subject. So chords, as I said, using scales, and scales basically have seven different keys. So not necessarily eight different notes, because usually your tonic chord is repeated as the last one, but so usually it's seven different keys, and this leads us to seven different progressions basically. All right, so you might stumble in chords be written in Roman numerals, and basically this is a different way to write the chords, mainly the chord progression. So how we can find out this? Well, I will go to the major scale just as an example. All right, so this in C major scale, our root note is C, right? This will be in Roman numerals D1 or only DI. All right. The root note often is called tonic. All right. If we step one, and if we go to the next available key in C major scale, we find the D. So D is our second available key, starting counting in our root notes, that is C. So D is the number 2. All right, and D, since it is very similar to our tonic, to our one, to our first note in this scale, it's called supertonic. So basically above the tonic. We have E, that is our third, called mediant. 4, that is our F, called subdominant, so below the dominant. We have G, that is 5, or our dominant. We have our sixth or 6, that is our submediant, and I will explain right soon. And B as our last unique, that is our 7th, so it is 7 in Roman numerals, that is called secondary mediant. So this A, that is our 6, it's called submediant, not because it's below E, but rather it's below our secondary mediant. This is also might be called as passing notes because it's so high in this progression that usually signifies that we are actually going back to the root note but one octave higher. So just to reinforce, it is in Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In terms, it is tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, secondary mediant, or our first note is the root note, and the highest note, the last unique note, is the passing note, or we can basically call it in the ordinal. So actually is our second, our third, our fourth, our fifth, and so on. When we play chords that is higher than our seventh, that is the B, in this case, we call it extended chords. And why we would extend a chord? Usually it's to add color, like make it a little bit more spicy, tasteful, because you could, whenever you want, just use three notes for the chords, for example, but it's way more richer, mainly for the listener. Our usually goal to have pleasure listen to our music. So actually it is very different, but I will experiment later. Let's go to the notation. First of all, I think I already said this, but even though we are in a major scale, not every single chord and not every single note we place in this context is major. For example, remember that I said major is whole step, half step, follow this basically pattern. Well, our C in a triad chord is C, whole step, E, so okay, half step, whole step to our fifth. So this is the perfect fifth chord, alright? But if I try to make, in this context, E as my root note and have a perfect fifth, I will have E, G, and B. Note that to reach G, I cannot have a whole step. Actually, G is 3 half steps away from me. So I can either reach it from half step plus whole step or whole step plus half step. I cannot reach in 2 whole steps. Actually, 2 whole steps or 4 keys array is actually this. So even though we are in a major scale, E is noted as minor, alright? Because in a minor scale, I can have this G because it is a whole step, half a step, alright? And this leads us to back to that Roman numerals, because you might actually stumble in Roman numerals that is in uppercase and in lowercase. The lowercase basically refers to minor. So in this context, 1 would be this perfect fifth, and E lowercase would be E minor. All right. So let me show the default notation of chords. So when you have just a letter like C or E and so on, we interpret as major, all right? And a perfect fifth with a third in a major scale. So if you just bump into, for example, D, will be read as D major with median and dominant. All right, so something like this. If you stumble in a letter with a small m next to it, basically it's a triad in a minor scale. So in this case would be C, F, A, like this. So in a C major scale, our numbers or our Roman numerals will be 1 Roman numeral, 1 uppercase, 2 and 3 lowercase, 4, 5 uppercase, 6 and 7th in a lowercase. All right. If you stumble in a number, in a letter with a 5 or with a no 3 next to it, it's basically our root note plus our fifth note, something like this. This is called as well power chord, or one of the most neutral chords, because it does not have our median, our third, so it lacks tension. All right. It can be the letter plus the number 6. It basically says that our fifth was shifted to the sixth. All right, so it is a perfect, so it is a triad chord like C and E, but instead our fifth on G, it is a sixth in A. You may stumble in a letter and a 7 next to it. It basically says that is a tetradic chord, so 4 notes at the same time, basically is stacking the perfect. So it is root plus third plus fifth plus seventh. You might stumble in augmented or diminished chord. Basically, it's a little bit more complicated, personally, to me, but it's basically when our notes in the fifth or higher is either 1/2 step upper, so in this case, sharp or augmented, or 1/2 step lower, so it is diminished. So for example, in this C major chord, if it is diminished, our G becomes G flat, and if it is augmented, it becomes G sharp. And what actually like get me tripping, it's because we basically stack perfect thirds, all right, to make extended chords, to make longer chords. But when you diminish or augmented a chord, so in this case, for example, this is the diminished fifth, right? To make a seventh, if I just place the B as it would be natural, this is not full diminished, this is half diminished. To make it diminished, fully diminished, I would, for example, take that G major, G sharp, G flat, stack a perfect third, right? So B flat, and diminish as well, so it becomes A flat, A. Something like this. I am not sure, alright, this might be wrong. So this was the hardest thing. I didn't like grasp totally the full idea, mainly because it seems like it applies to the chords but not to extended chords. So if I try to stack 11th, a 9th, would it would be D, not D flat or C or even B. I didn't understand completely, but you got it. It can be a letter and with, I think, parentheses as well, within parentheses, add something. This add something is usually for extended chords, and it is basically our perfect fifth plus that chord. So for example, this is our a C major chord, and if I add a ninth, it will be like this. You might stumble in a notation like a letter slash another letter, such as C slash E. By default, our baseline always play the root note of our chord. So if our chord is, for example, C, usually our instrument, that is the bass, will play C. All right. But if you stumble in this C, in this case C slash E, actually our bass is playing the E, so it happened an inversion. All right, so in this case, for example, we have this C E G chord. So imagine another instrument as my bass line, it would play the C. But if I note C slash E, actually my bass instrument will play the E. Alright? And lastly, at least as far as I am concerned, we have the Roman numeral slash Roman numeral. So it is different for the last one, because the last one we used the letters, the keys from the music. So in this case, we are using the Roman numerals notation, and basically says the key with that roll of the key with that roll. It might be a little bit confusing, but for example, in a C major chord, what is R5? Our dominant, G, right? So if my chord is notated as V slash V or 5 slash 5, it is read as dominant of our dominant. What is the dominant key of our dominant key? What is the dominant key of G major? It's D. Okay, now let's go to chromatic mediant. So you already know that mediant is our third, all right? So when you stumble into something called chromatic mediant, we already know as well that diatonic is when we are using only notes in that scale. So if I use only in a C major music, I only use C, D, E, F, G, A, B. I mean, I am in a diatonic context. But if I use another key, for example, C sharp, I am now in a chromatic. So I'm using keys that is not in that scale, in that key scale context. So chromatic mediant basically is the third that is out of our scale. And how we find them? For example, imagine we are in a major C major context, all right? So we are trying to find majors of that median. So I will just turn off the scale. I will go back to free. So we find both major and minor medians of that key. So if my root note is C, what is my third in a C major? It's E. What is my third or my median in a minor scale? E flat. Alright? So now remember that I said that our seventh is also called secondary median. So we also have to seek them. So what is the seventh or the secondary median of C major? It's B. And what is the secondary median of C minor? B flat. So now I make these my root notes and try to find the major of each one of them. Remember what is the pattern of major scale, at least up to the fifth, is whole step, half step, whole step. All right. In an E major is whole step will lead us to F, whole step to A flat. Half step would lead us to A, and a whole step would lead us to B. In a E flat, the major would follow the same logic. So F, G would be our third, and B flat would be our fifth. In the secondary medians, in B, our major would be E flat, F sharp, and in a B flat would be D, E, F. This is the chromatic medians of C major. So now let's go to chord progression. So even though you are totally able to use only one chord in the whole music, for example, C major, the listener might actually feel a little bit annoyed because it does not feel it is progression or feeling different things. Face music as another way to tell a story. So you'll have, for example, music that use chord progression, for example. So it is reading a book about exploring a dark forest, using magic and so on, for example. And not using chord progression would be the same thing as reading a book in your cell phone, for example, that is about someone that is using a cell phone, for example. So even though you know that that person might do is actually doing a whole different like thing, very impressive thing, you do not feel it because it's not being passed to it. This is the idea behind the chord progression. Actually, this is my interpretation. So progress your chords is actually a good way to reinforce that there is something happening in that story. All right. So how to write or how to find out the chord progression? Well, usually chord progression use Roman numerals. So you go, for example, you will use the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4. So actually learn the Roman numerals is very important as well. I think I forgot to say, but the diminished chord, for example, use that small circle next to it. All right. So how to like progress? I want to say beforehand that there is something in music called cadence. So when you are making a music, you have to think like you are writing a, a song lyrics. All right. So each voice or each instrument has its own line. The melodic line is usually the highest pitched one, but it can travel across different ranges actually. Every sentence basically has commas, has periods, has exclamation points, and so on. So actually, chord progression brings this feeling of punctuation. And how is this? Well, we have basically weak chord progression and strong chord progressions. The weakness is basically when we only step R, for example, D in a C major scale is only one step away from the root. So actually this cadence is weak. But if you go, for example, 1 to the 5th, so this is a leap. This is a very huge motion, all right? So when you move in a very contrasting way you are using this full cadence or actually a strong cadence. And as I said in the motive examples development, you can go, for example, from you can have, for example, 2 bars, 4 bars, 8 bars subjects. And to reinforce that subject had a finish, you might use strong cadence. All right. So if we have a hum that is our tonic chord, that is C major, we just start here and go to anywhere else and does not come back. This is the half cadence. This is strong to keep the feeling that something else will happen in the next right after. But if you don't want this feeling and actually close a whole idea, going back home is a good idea. So having a full cadence such as 5-1. As an example, this is a weak chord progression that feels like a comma. You will say more things later. So C and D. So you feel you didn't advance that much. Or you can progress even harder. So for example, 1, 4. 4 is our F. You can use this weak progression when you want to transmit that nothing, that in a more calm context, like representing that nothing very contrasting is happening, for example, but in your climax, like in the point of the music that is happening, like the most things is happening. Ideally, you should use your dominant chord. So in this case, our fifth, such as this. And ideally, you should come back home. So this is an example of chord progression that has a good cadence. You might able to reinforce this, for example, making the first chord neutral, so get rid of the median. You are able to stack chords, so in our climax is I'm actually using a seventh, and so on. And a really important part, do not get attached, even though mostly you might stumble in a chord progression such as with 3 different letters or numbers. So it's something like 1 4 5 1 or 1 3 7 1 3 7 5 1. But you are totally able to repeat the chord until you want, because the idea is to progress. So if you're in your melody, for example, it's not happening anything too different, or that you want to signalize that something happened or something changed, there is no reason to progress, unless, for example, if you want to get a little bit more funky, like dancing, you could use weak progressions such as 1 2 1 2 or 1 1 2 2, or in different beats used 1 and 2s and so on. So but this is the idea. All right, the chord progression should signalize that nothing is happening or something is happening or a huge thing is happening. Contrast is the best tool to make something pop out. Lastly, I would like to talk about circle of fifths. So you might stumble into this. I will try to explain in my way. All right. Basically, circle of fifths was it is a useful tool to understand how different keys and chords relate to each other. So you might stumble in this type of circular clock that I already talked in the Maestro application, but now I will try to explain in a more practical way. In the outer ring of a circle of fifths, you have major. All right, inside of it, you have the minor chord. You have the letter in the nun or one, number one or 12 in a clock. That is our starting point. That is the C. The more you go to the clockwise motion up to the seventh, you will add sharps. And the more you go counterclockwise, more flat, you will add up to 7. And how you find where is my next in this type of cycle? Well, basically, you always aim for the next fifth. Remember when I just talked about dominant of dominant is basically this. You will just walk cycle in the whole circle of fifths by using dominant of the current chord, current scale. For example, we start on C, right? So to the right, that is the clockwise motion. What is the next? Well, what is the dominant of C? Is G, right? So this is the next one. What is the dominant of G? Well, I can use this tool. I can use the tools. I can use this Slarmoo's box, for example, to explain. But if it is a G major, we know that is whole step, half step, whole step to find the pattern, the available keys. So whole step would lead us to B as my third. Half will lead us to C, and the whole step will lead us to D. So D is the next one. So far C, G, D. So what is the median or the third of D in a major scale? Well, it's F sharp. So F sharp. And my fifth would be A. So A is my next. So what is my dominant key in A major? Well, whole step, half step, whole step. E. So E is my next. And so on. You can use the tool itself, such as G, in my C major scale, and just change the key right here. So C, as I said, is G. So what is the G? Is D. So what is the D? A. What is the A? E, and so on. What is the E? B. B. F sharp. F sharp would be C sharp. So as I said, the highest number is 7th. So even though I could go to C sharp and get, for example, G sharp, this is not in the circle of fifth, but there is some left because we didn't had the clockwise motion. So we go back to C major, and now to complete, we should go back to our starting point, that is our C, and go in a counterclockwise motion, but now not in dominant, now on first, that is our subdominant. So what is the subdominant of C major? F, right? So what is the subdominant of F? B flat. And what is the but here in these key options we do not have the B flat, because remember, the flats and the sharps is basically the black keys, and black keys has two names: the previous sharp or the next flat. So we have here B flat. B flat can be A sharp, so it is A sharp. So the subdominant is E flat. So in E flat, that is also D sharp is A flat. In the A flat or G sharp is D flat. In a D flat or C sharp is G flat. And G flat is F sharp. So now we go back to B, alright? So this is the whole circle of fifths in a major or in the outer ring. But there is something inside of this circle of fifths. That is these relative minors. Well, in a C major scale, we have D, E, F, G, and so on. Some of them are majors. Remember that, as I said, the major or minor notation is totally individual. So the key, even in a C major or whatever the context, it might be minor, for example, because what defines if it is a major or minor is the number of steps or the possible steps to that we are able to take in order to have a triad. We used our fifth to go clockwise in a major, and fourth to go counterclockwise. So now in the relative major, we try to find the sixth of each chord. Well, in a C major, the sixth would be A, or the next, or the one upper above the G, that is our dominant. So it is A, and as you can see, A to C is 3/2 steps, so it is minor. All right, we already know it. So A, C, E is a minor. On a C major, the relative minor is A minor. So what is in the right of C in the major circle of fifths clockwise motion? G. So what is the relative major of G? E minor. So what was the next? D. What is the relative minor of D? B minor, and so on. So this is how circle of fifths works. We basically had the major that we basically took the right or the clockwise motion, where C does not have any sharps, and each motion adds a sharp to it up to 7. So actually we have 8 possibilities, basically using the current dominant to find the next step. And in the counterclockwise motion, we use the fourth or the subdominant of each one to find the next one. And now that we have the outer ring major, we can always pick the sixth of each of that chord. But why is this like useful? Well, even though you are making a music in a C major scale, for example, you can step out of this scale whenever you want. And actually, you can do whatever you want to the chord. You can stack a lot of keys, you can step out of the scale, but in order to make this sound conscious and consonant, or even dissonant, but with showing some reason behind, we kind of have to follow a little bit of steps. So, for example, about chords, you can have a tonal shift. So even though you are in a C major music, for example, you can just use another key and say that that is your new center tone. Your music will flow around and use that keys as reference. For example, you can shift the scale. You can actually change the scale. You can go, for example, from the mode of C major and go to A minor, for example. And you can change the mode, you can change the scale. For example, you can, in a C major, go to C minor. But maybe you want to go through the relative major, for example, in order to do something, to change these modes, to change the scales to sound that it was intended. You can borrow different chords. For example, you have, for example, a C major, dun, 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 but you want to add a little bit of contrast or dissonant or something like this. So you can go to the relative major, relative minor, that is the A minor, for example, borrow one of the progressions of A minor, for example, such as D minor, for example, and now you have a different chord, even though you are in a C major mode or music, for example. So think with this relative major a way to play around to go to the next point of your map. If you want to go around in a lot of different modes and scales, because yes, you can, for example, start in C major and just end in a F minor, for example. But ideally, the progression, the path you go from one to the second part to the third part should be kind of like logical. And the way that you go from here to there, you pass through usually these relative majors and minor, so everything sounds purposeful. So I talked a lot. Your ear is burning. My voice is very bad to hear, but I will end this with a, I don't know, a better way to do it, at least with a good example. All right, even though it is basic, I think it is a good example. So I will go from, for example, I will pick the nylon guitar and I will try to make a chord progression. So for example, I am in a C major. I can go, for example, 1 3 5 1, right? Something that I will actually ask you for you is to research how each instrument you are intended to use it, how they work, because some instruments does not work as you might think. For example, you are not able to play chords in a flute because you cannot like play two notes at the same time, even though you can, for example, you can play arpeggiated chords. All right, you cannot play, for example, C and G in a single flute. So know how the limit of each instrument, how many notes you can play at the same time, the normal or octaves or the range they use to play, like examples, practical examples, how they is being used is a good way to start. All right. So usually on guitars, we basically play the chord and then the melody, play the chord and then the melody, unless it is full melody or a full chord. So for example, what I can do is in the beginning of each bar, play the chord. So for example, 1 without the mediant, 4, 5, fifth, 1 again. So this is my chord progression. And I will use only diatonic notes to make a melody, a very simple melody, for example. So you can, as I said, use the chords in order to know which note you can play, for example. So I will just make a very simple melody, for example. So for example, and since we are in a web application that is used usually for a chip tune music, I will use chip. So thanks for watching and I see you in the next video. Bye.